Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 331. We are continuing and finishing our topic for this week, which is whether compulsory voting is justified. Remember, this is all in service of our broader project of thinking about democracy, not only whether it's justified, but if we're going to run our society democratically, what are some of the best policies and ways of running such a democracy? So let's get to it. So the day's plan, we're going to review some arguments in favor of compulsory voting. One of the things that Lever does really nicely in this paper is, even though she's against compulsory voting, gives a really nice layout of some of the reasons why a person might favor compulsory voting. We're then going to turn to Lever's objections to such a policy, and that'll do it for today. And just so you know, I'll be using CV in these slides to refer to compulsory voting throughout. So let's get to it. So Annabelle Lever is a philosopher working in the poli-sci department at the University of Geneva. And she has interests in feminist philosophy, rights to privacy, and intellectual property. I think that these concerns about privacy rights and rights of autonomy more generally are going to come through when we begin to look at Lever's arguments. So, first we're just going to review some of the considerations in favor of compulsory voting. So Lever points out that one point is that low turnout is unequal turnout. So the thought here is that if we have a lack of turnout, certain portions of the population, such as people of color, young people, poor people, people with less education, are less likely to be represented in the final vote tally. And there's a further thought that when we have unequal turnout, so when people of color and young people, for instance, don't show up at the polls, this is also going to reinforce social disadvantage. The thought, roughly, is that if you don't have these people represented in the vote, policies that might try to dismantle these social disadvantages are less likely to be enacted. Three, there's the thought that compulsion for voting is the best cure. So you might think of these 3 points as interlocking points about the thought that the way to solve these problems related to inequality is going to, best be addressed through fining people for not voting. This came through last time as well. So you're going to get better campaigns. So you're going to have less election costs, and you're going to have fewer smear campaigns. The thought here is that when voting is compulsory, the motivation for running smear campaigns will be less strong, because a big part of running negative ads against your opponent is actually to try to get supporters of that candidate not to show up. It's not really about, getting people to show up for the candidate who's actually running the ad. Some philosophers have pointed out that it actually doesn't violate any important liberties because there's a distinction between turning up and having your names ticked off the rolls, which is different from, determining whether somebody's actually voted. And compulsory voting does not, violate a person's right to privacy. It just makes sure that they, show up at the polling place and have their name ticked off a list. And here's the sixth point. that non-voters are free riders and free riding is morally wrong. So all of these considerations factored in to Birch's discussion last time. So the point about legitimacy as well as social inequality came out in points 1 and 2. Similarly with Birch's points about social unrest. Moreover, the point about procedural fairness, that the burdens of running a democracy should be shared, is another way of stating this point about the wrongness of free riding and free riders. Just a little more on this turnout versus voting distinction. This came through a little bit in Birch's point that it's logically confused that the right to vote entails a right to not vote. Now we have this thought that government cannot require speech, but according to philosophers who favor compulsory voting, like Liphart and Birch, they think that a requirement to show up at the polling station is not a requirement of speech or voting per se. After all, you have perfect privacy still, and you can still leave your ballot blank or spoil your ballot, i.e. you can fill it in a certain way so it won't count for anything. So we'll return to that point. As well, we'll return to this point that not voting is a kind of free riding. So you might recall that Glaucon in Book 2 of the Republic, way back at the beginning of the semester, said, why can't you just enjoy the benefits of a just society but act unjustly when you can get away with it? And we can characterize that as what's really fundamental to free riding. So the idea of free riding is making yourself an exception to a social rule that's beneficial when that rule is widely practiced. So in Lever's words, it's the idea of benefiting from a public good without doing your part to maintain it. So the thought here for reason 6 to favor compulsory voting is that people who don't vote are benefiting from the public good of having a democracy without doing their part to maintain it. Yeah. So, other common examples of free riding might be like minor theft, cheating on your taxes, or adding pollution to the atmosphere. We're depending on other people not to do these things, because if other people engaged in theft all the time, the prices and availability of products would go way up. Or the prices would go up, the availability would go down, or, if everybody was stealing, cereal at the grocery store, then they would start locking it up and you wouldn't be able to steal it anymore. But also things like cheating on taxes. You depend on others to pay your taxes, and you depend on others not to pollute. But then you do these things anyway. And that's the sense in which you're benefiting from a public good without doing your part to maintain that public good. So, free riding is obviously often considered as immoral. And there are many cases where government coercion is going to be used in order to prevent it. So, we have penalties for cheating on your taxes. So this is something for you to reflect on, and Lever is going to come back to this point. Do you think that not voting is kind of like free riding in the same way that cheating on your taxes or over polluting is free riding? Okay, so with that, we're going to move on to Lever's criticisms. So far we've just looked at Lever's summary of some of the reasons why compulsory voting is often favored. So, on the point about inequality and reinforced disadvantage, uh, Lever points out that it's neither necessary nor sufficient for social democratic, i.e., left-leaning governments. So there are a lot of social democratic governments that don't have mandatory voting, places like Scandinavia. And moreover, places like the Netherlands, if I remember right, used to have compulsory voting, but found it not worth the effort of enforcement. Lever also points to studies that suggest that it doesn't increase people's political knowledge. So you might think that, oh, well, if you make people vote, they will take the extra time to inform themselves. According to Lever and the study that she cites, apparently not. And moreover, it doesn't affect electoral outcomes. So it's not as if you get a government that speaks better to the concerns of, say, the working class or minorities any better. And it doesn't seem to change the way that political parties campaign. So it doesn't seem to make it more likely that parties will campaign on policies meant to benefit the poor. And moreover, it doesn't seem to make electoral campaigning any more efficient. So when it comes to the research, the benefits of compulsory voting have not yet been established, or at worst, the purported benefits have even been debunked. Lever also points out that compulsory voting ignores different reasons that different people have for not voting. So she points out that it's not clear that low turnout in and of itself is a bad thing, and that there's an important difference between being disenchanted with the selection of politicians you have as compared to people who feel like political participation is completely alien and not open to them. And it's really more this second kind of non-voting that would be a threat to the legitimacy of a democracy overall. And within this context, Lever points out that the rights and duties of a citizen are quite different from the rights and duties of their representatives. So we might think that non-voting is not a duty in the same way for a citizen as it is for one of their representatives. So for instance, representatives have different duties. They have a duty to vote in a legislature, but that's not clearly a general duty to vote for ordinary citizens have to vote. And there might be cases where particular citizens have a particular duty to vote. So if there's like a neo-fascist who's looking likely to win, it might be the duty of good, decent, right-thinking citizens to get in there and stop that neo-fascist candidate from winning. But that should be distinguished from a general duty to vote. Just to point out that there's a difference between the rights and duties of citizens as compared to the rights and duties of representatives. Representatives don't have a right to secret votes like people do. So just to point out that, when we think about the government as something that's working for the people and not the other way around, we might think that simply because there are democratic duties for our representatives does not imply that there are democratic duties of voting for the ordinary citizen. Penalties for non-voting. So some have argued, like Birch, that fines for not voting are designed to be non-onerous. But Lever points out that some citizens can and have been sent to prison for refusing to pay non-voting fines. So she appeals on page 66 of the paper to the case of Melissa Manson in Australia, who refused to pay her fine for not voting, and she had something of a conscientious objection to not voting. She didn't think that any of the candidates had earned her vote, and she was ultimately sentenced to 1 day in prison for refusing to pay her fines. More significantly, perhaps, is that in Italy, it's kept track of who votes and who doesn't vote. And some citizens have lost their right to enjoy childcare benefits. If you think that, your job might depend on having access to childcare, this is a big deal. So Lever points out that these penalties are not as insignificant as some proponents of compulsory voting have pointed out. So here's how Lever puts it. Before holding that compulsory voting is justified, therefore, we need to be prepared to make criminals of people who do not pay their fines for not voting. And we need to be confident that doing so is consistent with democratic values and objectives that animate the case for compulsion. So if we're trying to make people better represented and to bring legitimacy to government institutions, we might wonder if the actual enforcement is going to undercut those very goals. So moving on. Consider the right to abstain from voting. So Lever argues that the right to abstain from voting is important both symbolically and practically. So again, we can notice the difference between citizens and legislators. Citizens don't necessarily have all the duties that government officials have. And as Lever puts it, even if the law requires turning out rather than casting a legal ballot, she then points out that it's hard to see how we're justified in inconveniencing people to wait in line to wait in line to vote just to get ticked off a list. It seems like we're pestering citizens in an unjustifiable way. After all, we're concerned with getting citizens to vote, not getting them to tick their names off lists. So it seems that Lever is not impressed with this argument suggesting that compulsory voting laws aren't violations of significant rights. Because really, even though the law is technically punishing people for getting ticked off a list or not, what we're really doing is forcing people to come out and say something. So this right to abstain, we might think, is a significant right and isn't as trivial as Birch made it out last time. Let's look at this point about free riding. So Lever suggests that it's nonsensical to say that non-voters are both oppressed, that is, like they are suffering as victims of inequities, and to also say that they're free riding. So it's paternalistic to force people to vote in favor of their self-interest, to make poor people and people of color come out to the ballot box to vote for the people who are allegedly going to help them more. But it's hard to characterize non-voting as free riding because it's hard to identify a specific public good that compulsory voting protects. So, as Lever points out, it's implausible to suggest that a government that doesn't have compulsory voting, that has, a 50 or 60% turnout, is an illegitimate government. And in that sense, we then begin to wonder, well, what particular public good are we protecting when we have people come out and vote? Well, if we can't identify one, then it's hard to pin this accusation of free riding on non-voters. Remember, it's benefiting from a public good without doing your part to maintain that public good. So, the way that Lever sees it, the case for compulsory voting really depends on some bad analogies. So, you can't just argue, according to Lever, that voting should be mandatory because serving on juries and paying your taxes should be. She says that for each of these policies that involves some mandatory compulsion, there is an identifiable public good. So, she points out that, when it comes to mandatory taxation, there's proportionality and the very poorest within society. So, if you make under, $20,000 a year, you're probably going to be exempt from paying any taxes, depending on your exact municipality. And moreover, you can't be exempted from taxation via conscientious objection. So, there's like an interesting difference between, paying taxes, which is about, upkeeping social institutions that we all benefit from, as compared to, say, a military draft. And if you consider something like mandatory jury service, well, the thought here is that there's an important rationale for making jury service mandatory. And it's based on the thought that we need equality and fairness when we have jury trials, and that by having mandatory jury service, it's going to promote, having a jury of peers. You might get some like very weird busybodies, as it were, if you only had voluntary juries. So the thought is there are specific rationales for the structure and existence of these certain kinds of government compulsion. So the way that Lever sees it, there is not a clear rationale for compulsion in the case of voting. Remember, it doesn't seem that we promote social equality, through compulsory voting. We don't have governments that are any more responsive to the needs of the young or the poor or people of color when compulsory voting is made the case. And the point about legitimacy is at least strained. We don't think that the governments of Canada or the United States are illegitimate governments simply on the basis of the worrying fact that voter turnout is pretty low. Just one more issue to flag before we wrap up. Lever is also skeptical of Birch's suggestion that there should be a none of the above option on ballots, or that this will solve some of the concerns about forcing people to show up and have their say. For one thing, she says it's actually kind of hard and perplexing to figure out what should be done if the none of the above option on a ballot wins. In that case, do you have to redo the election or have a citizens' council? It's hard to say. Moreover, it's a possibility that a none vote will be hard to interpret. So does it mean that all the candidates are unimpressive? That every single one of them lacks the qualifications that the voter is looking for? Or is it just the voter being mad that they're forced to take time out of their day and show up to vote. So this is maybe like a broader point about the misinterpretation of voting behavior. So sometimes a person might decide to stay home because they think that that expresses something, and they also don't want to add support or legitimacy to either, the current government or the opposition. And in that sense, Lever's argument seems to suggest that you can say something of significance by refusing to turn up to vote. Now, that doesn't mean that every refusal to vote is, a principled stand that a person makes. It might be, in some cases, that a person is just lazy. But the point that voting behavior can be hard to interpret, according to Lever, is going to weaken the case for this point that we lose government legitimacy when we don't have everybody turning up to the poll, because non-voting might be seen as a kind of expression in and of itself. So, just to sum up, Lever has pointed out that the purported benefits of compulsory voting have been merely speculative, when we claim that it will make campaigning more efficient or less negative, and in some cases, these purported benefits have even been discredited. It doesn't seem to do anything about concerns about unfreedom, like oppression of people, nor does it help us really solve problems of inequality or illegitimacy. In the case of inequality, it doesn't seem to fix much. In the case of illegitimacy, we might think that, well, it seems like countries with low voting turnout may well have at least enough legitimacy already. And then finally, there's this thought that compulsory voting violates some non-trivial rights of non-participation. Not participating is a way of having your say, at least sometimes. So it's not necessarily part of a functional democracy. Now, Lever does concede that maybe in a non-functioning democracy, or in a state where serious questions of corruption and illegitimacy have been flagged, there might be a specific responsibility, and an enforceable one perhaps, to get everybody to turn up. But that is a special and unique case. It's not specific to, all ordinary democracies. So that'll wrap up our 1 week look at compulsory voting. So I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say about this. Is there a way we can improve the case for compulsory voting? Is there something that Lever missed in her case against compulsory voting? I'll look forward to hearing from y'all in the discussion boards what you have to add to that conversation. And then next week, we're going to look at one last paper for the term. So next week, we're going to be looking at a paper by Tommy Pito, and the paper is called Why the Voting Age Should Be Lowered to 16. So that'll be the last sort of paper and video lecture type module for the course. And then our last topic will be to watch and discuss a film by Astra Taylor called What is Democracy? So you'll be able to access that movie through Canopy, which you should be able to access through your UNC-G library account. It's also a good source for other movies, which you might need access to to deal with all this time we're all spending at home these days. And if you want an alternative to watching a film, you can also listen to an interview with the director, Astra Taylor. She has a good interview on the Ezra Klein podcast. So that'll be another option, if you want to hear some of Taylor's thoughts about democracy while, going out for a walk instead of staying in and watching a movie. But you'll be able to earn some quiz points by connecting some themes in either the film or the interview to prior course material. And you'll also be able to earn some discussion points in our regular forums, as we have been throughout the semester. And that is basically it for today. Thanks for listening in, and be well, and don't hesitate to get in touch. All right, bye.